Black Books Part 3. For Part 1, click here. That's the playlist. You can watch Part 2 and then Part 3. Welcome to jump in the middle. It's a free platform, I suppose, right? Okay. Picking up right where we left off. After this, he had a similar issue. In the winter, I once stood at the window deep in the night and looked north. There I saw a blood-red glow, stretched from east to west over the northern horizon, like a flicker of the sea seen from far. And someone asked me at that time what I thought about the future of the world. I told him that I hadn't thought, but I saw blood, streams of blood. In the years directly preceding the outbreak of war, apocalyptic imagery was widespread in European arts and literature. For example, in 1912, the Russian painter Wassily Kandinsky wrote of a coming universal catastrophe. From 1912 to 1914, Ludwig Miedner painted a series of works known as the apocalyptic landscapes, with scenes of destroyed cities, corpses, and turmoil. Prophecy was in the air. In 1899, the famous American medium Leonora Piper predicted that in the coming century there would be a terrible war in different parts of the world that would cleanse the world and reveal the truths of spiritualism. All right. In 1918, Arthur Conan Doyle, hey, there's a name I recognize, the spiritualist and author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, spiritualist, really? Wow. Viewed this as having been prophetic. Well, that's going to change my how I view Sherlock Holmes forever. In Jung's account of the fantasy on the train in Liber Novus, I get the feeling it's assumed that anybody reading these has already read the Red Book, so I'm doing it backwards, reading the prequel first, like watching never mind, episodes 1 through 3 of Star Wars before New Hope. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, the inner voice said that what the fantasy depicted would become completely real. It seems probable that what took place was a hypnagogic vision. That is, he entered into a stream of imagery in a state of drowsiness while reading a book. Initially, he interpreted this subjectively and prospectively, as depicting the imminent destruction of his world. His reaction to the experience was to undertake a psychological investigation of himself. In this epoch, self-experimentation was used in medicine and psychology. Introspection had been one of the main tools of psychological research. Jung came to realize that transformations and symbols of the libido, I think that's a quote, could be taken as myself, and that an analysis of it leads inevitably into an analysis of my own unconscious processes, end quote. He had projected his material onto the fantasies of an American woman he had never met, Miss Frank Miller. Up to this point, Jung had been an active thinker and had been averse to fantasy. Quote, as a form of thinking, I held it to be altogether impure, a sort of incestuous intercourse, thoroughly immoral from an intellectual viewpoint. End quote. He now turns to analyze his fantasies, carefully noting everything, and had to overcome considerable resistance in doing this. Quote, permitting fantasy in myself had the same effect as would be produced on a man if he came into his workshop and found all the tools flying about doing things independently of his will. End quote. In studying his fantasies, Jung realized that he was studying the myth-creating function of the mind. I realized that until 1900, I had kept a diary, and I thought that this would be a possibility for me, to try to observe myself. This would be an attempt to meditate on myself, and I began to describe my inner states. These represented themselves to me in a literary metaphor. For example, I was in a desert, and the sun shone unbearably, parentheses, sun, hyphen, consciousness, end parentheses, end quote. His first move was to attempt to find imaginistic correlates, those to his emotional states. He picked up his brown notebook, which he had set aside in 1902, and began writing in it. He recalled that in his childhood, he used to like to build houses and structures, and he took this up again to reconnect with that time. He built a church with a red pyramidal stone as the altar, gathering stones from the lake shore at the bottom of his garden. This reminded him of his childhood dream of the underground phallus. Okay. He would usually do this after lunch. That's when you do underground phallus type things, right? After lunch. Sorry. And also sometimes in the evening. Yeah, of course. It clarified his thoughts and led him to notice fantasies, which he then recorded in the black books. He had the feeling that he was practicing a rite, as in mythology. Regarding his writing, he recalled in 1923, quote, for the sake then of trying to achieve the maximum honesty with myself, I wrote everything down carefully, following the old Greek mandate, quote within quotes, give away all thou possessest, then thou shalt receive, end quote within quotes, end quote. This was from the Mithraic liturgy. It occurred to Jung that he could write down his reflections in a sequence. He was, quote, writing autobiographical material, but not as an autobiography, end quote. From the time of the Platonic dialogues onward, the dialectical form has been a major genre in Western philosophy. That's a genre, and that was a coconut falling on somebody's roof. In 387 Common Era, St. Augustine wrote his Soliloquies, which presented an extended dialogue between himself and, quote, reason, end quotes, who instructs him. The work begins with the following lines. When I had been pondering many different things to myself for a long time, and had for many days been seeking my own self, and what my own good was, and what evil was to be avoided, there suddenly spoke to me. What was it? I myself or someone else? Inside or outside me? Parentheses, this is the very thing I would love to know but don't. End parentheses, end quotes. While writing book 2, he posed a question. I said to myself, quote, what is this I am doing? It certainly is not science. What is it? End quote. Then a voice said to me, quote, that is art. End quote. This made the strangest sort of impression upon me, because it was not in any sense my impression that what I was writing was art. Then I came to this, quote, perhaps my unconscious is forming a personality that is not I, but which is insisting on coming through to expression, end parentheses. So the work begins, reason instructed him, St. Augustine, which presented a dialogue that instructs him. So that first quote was St. Augustine, and then while writing book 2, he posed a question. Is he St. Augustine or Jung? I'm asking because I don't know, because it's not clear. Right, okay. Yes. I can't imagine St. Augustine being, like, is this reason or is it art? What is art? But maybe I just don't know St. Augustine well enough. I know him as the guy who told the king of Kent to write down, if you steal from the church, you have to pay it back 12-fold in Latin letters with Anglo-Saxon vernacular, and thus creating the English language. Not as a guy who's, is this science or is this art? This must be Jung. I don't know why exactly, but did I read? Okay. Then I came to this. Perhaps my unconscious is forming a personality that is not I. This has got to be Jung. It was a little unclear how that was written. Saying, and Augustine said this, and then in book 2 he wrote this. You mean Jung or St. Augustine? Come on. The work begins. Okay. Yes, but which is insisting on coming through to expression, end quote. I don't know why exactly, but I knew to a certainty that the voice that had said my writing was art had come from a woman. ... It's always good to have 4 dots just to keep people guessing. Well, I said very emphatically to this voice that what I was doing was not art, and I felt a great resistance grow up within me. No voice came through, however, and I kept on writing. This time I caught her and said, quote, no, it is not, end quote, and I felt as though an argument would ensue. He thought that this voice was, quote, the soul in the primitive sense, end quote, which he called the anima, parentheses, the Latin word for soul, end parentheses. Quote, in putting down all this material for analysis, I was in effect writing letters to my anima. That is part of myself with a different viewpoint from my own. I got remarks of a new character. I was in analysis with a ghost and a woman, end quote. In retrospect, he recalled that this was the voice of a Dutch patient he had known from 1912 to 1918, who had persuaded a psychiatrist colleague that the latter was a misunderstood artist. The woman had thought that the unconscious was art, but Jung had maintained that it was nature. Okay. I have previously argued that the woman in question was Maria Moltzer, and that the psychiatrist in question was Jung's friend and colleague Franz Ricklin, who increasingly forsook analysis for painting. In 1913, he became a student of Augusto Giacometti, the uncle of Alberto Giacometti, and an important early abstract painter in his own right. The first sequence, from November to December 1913, could be characterized as the search for a method. It depicts Jung turning toward his soul and undertaking a reconsideration of his life, a transvaluation of values. Up to this point, he had been successful and had achieved all that he had sought. Then came the vision on the way to Schaffhausen, which provoked him to return to his soul. He considered himself an anchorite in his own desert, trying to find visual metaphors to contain and express his experience. He experienced doubt and confusion. There was no movement until December 11th. So he had been addressing his soul for a month before receiving a reply. A dialogue now developed. His soul told him that he was not his mother. He should be patient. The way to truth was to those without intentions, and the way to truth was to those without intentions. All right. He needed to realize that intentions limit life. He addressed his feeling of self-scorn, and his soul told him that this was out of the question. Scorn was only an issue if he was completely vain. She asked if he knew who she was. Had he made her into a dead formula? On December 12th, as he recounted in his 1925 seminar. Not knowing what would come next, I thought more introspection was needed. When we introspect, we look within and see if there is anything to be observed. And if there is nothing, we may either give up the introspective process, or find a way of, quote, boring through, end quote, to the material that escapes the first survey. I devised such a boring method by fantasizing that I was digging a hole, and by accepting this fantasy as perfectly real. Jung had probably actually started by physically digging holes in his garden down by the water to release his fantasies. He then began to imagine doing the same while seated in his library. He descended into the depths and a fantasy sequence unfolded. His, quote, I, end quote, found himself in a dark cave. He saw a red stone, which he tried to reach through muddy water. The stone covered an opening in the rock. He placed his ear to the opening and heard a stream and saw a person who had been killed float past, as well as a black scarab. A red sun shone at the bottom of the stream, and there were serpents on the wall, which crawled toward the sun and eventually covered it. Blood sprang forth and then subsided. This was a striking, horrific image. During what unfolded, he was involved passively as a spectator. This process shifted on December 21st. He encountered the figures of Elijah, the blind Salome, and a serpent. Jung's eye looked into a stone and saw in it Eve, followed by Odysseus on his journeys. Elijah told Jung's eye that Salome was his daughter, and that they had been companions since eternity. Salome told Jung's eye that she loved him. Elijah told him that Salome loved a prophet and announced the new God to the world. Jung's eye was shocked at all this. He heard wild music. He wondered if Salome loved him because he had murdered the hero. He had further encounters with Elijah and Salome on December 22nd and 25th. These critical fantasies signaled a breakthrough from passive witnessing to active engagement. He had broken through a barrier. A method had been found and consolidated. Trusting to his soul's vision, he entered into an exchange with the figures, listened to them, and allowed himself to be instructed. This became his via regia to the imaginal world. The fantasies in the black books may be understood as a type of dramatized thinking in pictorial form. As one reads them, the impact of Jung's mythological studies become clear. Some of the figures and conceptions derive directly from his readings. The form and the style of his fantasies bear witness to his fascination with the world of myth and epic. In these entries, Jung was both a participant in and scribe of his interior imaginal dramas, bearing witness to what he encountered. The first phase of his undertaking may be characterized as a religious quest, an effort to recover a sense of meaning in his life. In December 1913, he referred to this first black book as Book of My Most Difficult Experiments. In retrospect, he recalled, "My scientific question went, what would happen if I switched off consciousness? I noticed from dreams that something stood in the background, and I wanted to give this a fair chance to come forward. One submits to the necessary conditions, as in a mescaline experiment, so that it emerges." In a later entry in his dream book on April 17, 1917, he noted, quote, "Since then, frequent exercises in the emptying of consciousness," end quote. These statements indicate that his interest was in studying what emerged when one emptied consciousness and allowed whatever was in the background to emerge. His procedure was clearly intentional, while its aim was to allow psychic contents to spontaneously emerge. He recalled, quote, "Sometimes it was as if I heard with ears. Sometimes I felt it in the mouth, as if my tongue formulated words. And then it came that I heard myself whisper a word to myself. Under the threshold of consciousness, everything was living." End quote. Jung had extensive experience studying mediums in trance states, during which they were encouraged to produce waking fantasies and visual hallucinations, and he had conducted experiments with automatic writing. Practices of visualization had also been used in various religious traditions. For example, Saint Ignatius of Loyola's fifth spiritual exercise instructs individuals to, quote, "see with the eyes of the imagination the length, breadth, and depth of hell," end quote, and to experience this with full sensory immediacy. Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688 through 1772, engaged in spiritual writing. Excuse me, dog, would you mind refraining from your barking right now? Because it's a little bit annoying while I'm trying to record. I'm sure it's a little bit annoying while trying to listen to reciting, so if I pay you, if I promise to give you a bone later. An entry into his spiritual diary reads, 26 January 1748. "Spirits, if permitted, could possess those who speak with them so utterly that they would be as though they were entirely in the world, and indeed in a matter so manifest that they could communicate their thoughts through their mediums, and even by letters, for they have sometimes, and indeed often, directed my hand when writing, as though it were their own, so that they thought it was not I but themselves writing." That's the end of the margin change and font shrinking that indicates that that was a Jung quote or St. Augustine one time. Anyway, so we're back to Sonu. From 1909 onward in Vienna, the psychoanalyst Herbert Silberer conducted experiments on himself in hypnagogic states. Silberer attempted to allow images to appear. These images, he maintained, presented symbolic depictions of his immediately preceding thought. Silberer corresponded with Jung and sent him off-prints of his articles. In 1912, Ludwig Staudenmayer, 1886 through 1933, a professor of experimental chemistry, published a work entitled Magic as an Experimental Science. Staudenmayer had embarked on self-experimentations in 1901, commencing with automatic writing. A series of characters appeared, and he found that he no longer needed to write to conduct dialogues with them. He also induced acoustic and visual hallucinations. The aim of his enterprise was to use his self-experimentation to provide a scientific explanation of magic. He argued that the key to understanding magic lay in the concepts of hallucination and the, quote, underconsciousness, end quote, parentheses, Unterbewusstsein, right, end parentheses, and, or whatever that's not an F, that's like one of those B, it's like a capital B, but it's more like a snake. I don't know what that is. And he placed particular importance on the role of personification. Thus, we see that Jung's procedure closely resembled a number of historical and contemporary practices with which he was familiar. And that's the end of the section, so it seems to me a good place to stop. Interesting. Very interesting. The idea of these beings or these creatures or whatever you want to call them in the unconscious or the subconscious or maybe the collective unconscious, if such a thing exists. I mean, I only mean that it takes a bit of a leap. One can work with one's own subconscious and one's own dream states and surmise that because humans share 99 point something 9, right, percent of the same DNA, we all carry the same instructions. I mean, from a purely rational scientific perspective, we all carry the same instructions which result in this complex human brain, which has what we might term subconscious or an unconscious or a under consciousness or, dream consciousness or an emotional consciousness, which then the collective consciousness or unconscious could be seen as something that results from the social interactions of humans in groups, so that if everybody sees the same TV show, then everybody might dream about Spock, and it's because we all saw the same TV show or lived through the same war or experienced the same weather, and then that leads one to think that, well, the collective consciousness over here might be different from the collective consciousness over there, right? But if one takes a leap and looks beyond the ephemeral brains and skulls, right, separated from each other by big pockets of air, one could maybe abuse quantum theory and say that, there's some kind of direct link going on between the subatomic particles and the neurons in my head and someone else's. At a certain point, it seems to me that it ceases to be useful to use pure reason. I mean, in the sense of pure ephemeral, which was interesting because he was talking about, well, from an intellectual position, purely intellectual, it's immoral to fantasize. And it's like, oh, I don't think you understand what intellect means. I mean, far be it for me to presume to have an insight greater than that of Carl Jung when he was in his 30s. But, well, anyway, that goes off into a different philosophical train of thought. But anyway, yeah, the idea that these things are alive, that these creatures are alive. I mean, of course they are, just as alive as we are. If someone has what do they call multiple personality disorder these days? There's a new name for that, isn't there? This is 2023, by the way, for the people in the future. I'm sure you've had 4 or 5 different renamings of everything since then, right? Anyway, yeah, so which personality is alive and which, they're both alive. It's happening inside of a live person, so it's alive. So this woman that he's interacting with inside of him is alive inside of him. That's very interesting. It reminds me a little bit of this one time I was doing a lot of this is reminding me of Pathworking the Moon card for people familiar with Golden Dawn system of magic. And one particular time I decided rather than going toward the dogs, speaking of dogs, we got a blonde dog that's mean and a black dog that just follows the blonde one around. Here it's the landlord's dogs. So there's a little bit of a moon card pathworking thing happening at this period in our present day history, my wife and I. But anyway, rather than follow the dogs down the yellow brick road to the pillars, I decided to turn around and go into the ocean because I thought that there were some inner demons I needed to confront. So there I was, and I was going deeper and deeper into the ocean, and then I was submerged in the ocean, and I was seeing sea creatures. And I was like, okay, where are the inner demons? Where are these inner demons? And then there was just a bunch of sea creatures, and I could see more and more of them, and some of them had sharp teeth and stuff. And so I was like, okay. And, and I did some kind of like sending out an earth-banishing pentagram or a banner of the West or something. And all of them fled, except for one little crawdad crab thing was on the ground in front of me, like kind of scared. So I threw a banner of the West at it, I think, and its shell flew off. And then it was this naked little crab still shaking and looking at me. But I was thinking, this powerful exorcism symbol didn't make it go away. So it must be good, right? So I said, what is your name? And he said, Baggit. And I said, what is your purpose, Baggit? What do you do? And he said, I don't know. And then he ran away. And so right after that is when I started working in for those familiar, the character of Baggit as Blythe's little brother in the in the New World Empire story. So that's, and now you know Baggett's origin story. But yeah, it's a similar kind of self-experimental work. Then I invoked the goddess Isis, by that name or by whatever name, the high goddess, the mother goddess. And she came and said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm here to confront and overcome my inner demons. And she says, the path is that way. You overcome the darkness by keeping your eyes fixed on the light. I don't know. That was the message I got at the time. Not saying that you should write that down and accept it as dogma, because it happened to me in a dream state once. But that was that. So, all right. Before this one runs on too long, got some stuff scheduled today. I've got to make send some text messages and whatnot. So thank you for joining me, and we'll pick up right where we left off next time with, can you see that? All right, I'll just go with Carl Jung's The Black Books.